CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Trump turns himself in. The former president prepares to face criminal charges in a watershed hearing in New York. Thousands of his supporters gather outside the court.
Our other headlines, the chairman of Credit Suisse apologises to angry investors for taking the bank to the brink of bankruptcy.
Falling to earth and filing for bankruptcy. Virgin Orbit goes into freefall after a disastrous rocket launch earlier this year.
And the Finnish flag is raised at NATO headquarters as it becomes the 31st country of the Defence Alliance. The length of Russia's border with NATO countries has now doubled.
Donald Trump is hours away from an historic court appearance in New York, the first time a former US president has faced criminal charges.
Trump is set to surrender to the authorities at the Manhattan courthouse, where he'll be fingerprinted and formally charged. This case centres around an alleged hush money payment to a porn star during the 2016 presidential campaign. Trump is expected to plead not guilty. He says this case is political persecution and has called for protests.
Well, our correspondent John Terrett is outside the courthouse in New York. John, we have now heard from Donald Trump. What did he say?
Yes, we heard from him on Truth Social. Now, I keep referring to it as Twitter because that's what everybody refers to when people send out tweets like this. But it was actually on his Republican conservative equivalent of Twitter called Truth Social. And he writes the following of this case here. He says, very unfair venue with some areas that voted 1% Republican. This case should be moved to nearby Staten Island. Would be a very fair, secure location for the trial. Additionally, the highly partisan judge and his family are well-known Trump haters. He was an unfair disaster on a previous Trump-related case, and so it goes on like that. Now, the former president of the United States is presently in Midtown Manhattan at Trump Tower. We're expecting him to come here to the criminal court in Lower Manhattan, about 3.5 miles away, sometime in the course of the next hour. And the case itself, which will be very brief, gets underway at about 2 o'clock local time. So that's, 18 hours GMT. Now, he came up from Florida yesterday, spent the night in New York. He's coming here to be arraigned. Essentially, you can think of that as him coming here to be arrested. Basically, that's what it means. Everything after this gets a little bit fluid. We simply don't know for sure whether he will be fingerprinted, whether he will be photographed for a mugshot, whether there'll be any kind of walk into the court. All of this, everybody will tell you a different story. So we simply don't know. We're just going to have to live the experience. And what an experience it will be as well. Because we've seen some things in this city in our time, as you know, and we have never seen a former president of the United States be indicted for a crime, as we are going to see in the course of the next couple of hours. It all relates to a payment that was made before the 2016 general election to an adult film star, and it is being reported that there are 34 felony charges. They're not misdemeanors. This is just what's being reported. I'm simply relaying it to you. And they're all to do, apparently, with the falsification of business records. So the People versus Donald Trump is about to get underway here on a very sunny lunchtime in Lower Manhattan. Robin and Jamie?
So, John, we can hear people blowing whistles behind you, perhaps crowds of supporters we can see in some live pictures we're looking at now. What's the security like at the moment in Manhattan?
Well, I'm glad you can see pictures of it. We're going to get Luke, who's our camera operator, to spin round the camera as well, so you can get a look at exactly what I'm seeing here. I mean, it is very, very tight, and it's been that way for the last 24 hours. You know, there are 35,000 police officers in the NYPD, the New York Police Department. They're all on duty today, all of them in uniforms. There were small protests last night close to Trump Tower in Midtown, where Trump was staying. This protest you're looking at now is dueling protests between Trump supporters and Trump dislikers, just literally outside the courthouse. Now, it's relatively peaceful. It's quite loud, but they're being very peaceful, and the police here are in their droves, as you can imagine. President Trump has called for loud, frequent protests. I must tell you that I think that the stomach for protests of any kind that might even approach the scale of what we saw on the 6th of January 2021, there is no stomach for that. However, this protest here, you know, I mean, it could get out of hand. We're all rather anxious about that. We're just going to, like so much in this case, going to have to wait and see, Robin and Jamie.
John, thank you very much for that. That's our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York.
Mark Shanahan is Associate Professor of Political Engagement at the University of Surrey. I asked him which of the many charges Donald Trump is reportedly facing is likely to be the most serious.
Probably the charges that he'll face today are the least of his troubles, despite the fact that we are hearing that it could be 30 felony charges. It's unlikely that even if he was found guilty of these charges, that he'd serve any time in jail. But there are other investigations that are swirling around, that are coming to a head, where clearly the prosecutors want to see what happens in Manhattan today as to whether they will press the button and go ahead with their own charges. For instance, around the January 6th insurrection, around taking government documents, presidential documents, and holding on to them at Mar-a-Lago. Perhaps the one that he would fear most is down in Fulton County, down in Atlanta in Georgia, where there is a move to try and indict him on interfering with the election back in 2020. If he was indicted and found guilty on that, he would serve serious jail time. And, I mean, whatever happens today, it's a humiliation for the president. He may well try and turn it into some kind of martyrdom, but this is unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
Just for the sake of clarity, I mean, regardless of the charges and how many or how few, he still will be able to run for president, will he not?
Absolutely. There is nothing in the Constitution that would stop him running for president. He could even be found guilty and go to jail and still be running for president. He could even be elected while in jail, and then perhaps maybe he'd pardon himself, although that's far easier said than done. This is not something that the framers of the Constitution ever thought about. The presidency was supposedly for the greatest and the best of American citizens, but perhaps that's not the case in the 21st century.
Mark, you would have thought Joe Biden's supporters would be rubbing their hands in delight at all of this, but of course this means blanket Donald Trump on the American networks, which during this incredibly long election campaign that we see in the United States is perhaps ironically bad news for Joe Biden and his campaign.
Absolutely. In 2016, Donald Trump got elected to the American presidency by making himself the story. Every day he would go out with some kind of a tweet that would make him the story, and the rest of the political field and all of the media would react. This, weirdly, gives him a huge platform to be the story again. And it's going to be very, very difficult for any other politician to get any oxygen of publicity, while this case, however it turns out, meanders its way through to the court.
Credit Suisse's chairman has apologised for taking the Swiss bank to the brink of bankruptcy as he faced shareholder fury in Zurich.
The bank has been holding its final annual general meeting after it was rescued last month by rival UBS. Outside the annual general meeting, protesters held up a capsized boat to represent the bank's demise. Inside, shareholders took to the stage to vent their frustration, demanding further explanation for the deal that saw their investments plunge in the $3.25 billion merger.
I lost 10,000 Swiss francs. It's not so much, but it's not good.
Chairman Axel Lehmann addressed shareholders, saying he'd run out of time to turn the bank around.
Until the end, we fought hard to find a solution, but ultimately there were only two options: deal or bankruptcy. The merger had to go through. The terms had to be accepted. The only alternative would have been a restructuring under Swiss banking law. This would have led to the worst scenario, namely a total loss for shareholders, unpredictable risks for clients, severe consequences for the economy and the global financial markets.
Justin Urquhart-Stewart is an investment manager and business commentator. Justin, welcome again. Good to see you. During today's shareholders meeting, the chairman saying the company is devoting all its energy for a successful future with UBS. How did that go down?
Yeah, like a lead balloon. Absolutely ridiculous. Because hardly surprising. Credit Suisse has had a lot of problems for many years. As we have Mr. Lehman there, didn't have enough time to turn the business around. It couldn't be turned around. What he had to do was try and keep it afloat. And so what you've got there is a business which is actually extremely old-fashioned in the way it's been going about. So in terms of regulatory control, compliance and openness, it hasn't been there. And so it's finding itself then losing business. It has some very bad investment structures, particularly on the debt side. And also, bear in mind, bigger picture for Switzerland, it's been losing business anyway. Why? Well, because of actually the regulatory requirements of the EU, even if they're not part of it. And so business has been going east, particularly for centres like Singapore.
So they've been trying and failing to turn the business around. What could Credit Suisse have done differently?
Well, in many ways, actually split themselves up into different areas. And because what you've often got with these big banks, huge monoliths, they like to try, the Americans, to have a star running it, which is always a bad sign. But actually then get people to focus on their own particular areas. So they've both got wealth management businesses, so those aren't going to merge together very well. So there'll be a lot of redundancies there. The analysts, they're less analysts than they were before. And so what you've got is different areas focusing on in their own little businesses, and no one actually pulling it together. It could have been saved, but by trying to be more original in the development of the next generation of banks. You can see all the banks in the high street and all over the world, branches are going to be closed. Why? Technology. So Credit Suisse was going to have to redesign itself. Trying to redesign a dinosaur doesn't work. They've died.
The CEO also admitted they just simply couldn't reverse the loss of trust because Credit Suisse's problems started, as he said, long before that. What did he mean exactly, and how long before?
Well, trust is the one word you have to use when you're banking, because there you are, putting my money, like Mary Poppins almost. I want my money back, please. Banks don't actually just take your money and then lend it out. They will borrow themselves. They will be investing some of that money. And if they don't have the expertise to realise, for example, as we've just seen over the past year or so, interest rates rising, what happens to those nice bond markets, particularly longer-dated bonds, where the price will go down? Well, anybody who could actually spell the word bond probably would have actually vaguely understood this. Maybe it doesn't translate into Cantonese, Swiss, Cantonese, French. But so these areas were long been festering away. Also, frankly, some of their wealth management areas, again, reliant on often salesmen. That's an old-fashioned way of going about it. That's not how investments are going to be run in the future. So I'm afraid it was almost doomed. The problem that UBS have got is what are they going to do now? Because they've got some similar issues. They've got a much better reputation. But this is why the Swiss are so embarrassed now. What are they good at, apart from cuckoo clocks and a bit of chocolate? That's gone anyway. And if you're saying the last thing is banking, and the other big player's gone, that's it. Thank you. I'll try somewhere else.
So this merger was designed to save the day, the merger between UBS and Credit Suisse. But that's now being investigated by the Swiss federal prosecutor. What's going to happen now?
Oh, I mean, this is it. Again, back to this issue of trust and actually no clarity is what's going on. This is just a sort of an area of fog you can't see through. Where are the risks? Where are the losses? If banks can't identify that and come out and tell you where things are going right and wrong, they don't know what's happening. That's a reason for you not to be anywhere near those banks. And it's not just Swiss banks, there's many others as well. If you want to point at someone else, you can point and say Deutsche Bank. That too is going to have to go through huge changes. And before the British get too pompous about it, they've already also got some dodgy ones.
We'll talk about the wider international banking landscape in just a moment. I just want to bolt you down into the Swiss picture. What does this chapter say about Swiss banking and its future? Where does it go next, realistically?
Realistically, they've got an old model of banking, which they thought, because it was a tradition, old-fashioned Swiss security, therefore that will carry us through. I'm afraid it doesn't. You lose that vital word of confidence, and people will move their money elsewhere, particularly if you're operating on somebody else's behalf. So I have almost subcontracted things to Credit Suisse, because that'll be all right. What they're doing is they've damaged the Swiss brand itself. Now there are other alternatives which have built up reputations and seem to be well regulated. Something like Singapore is very highly regulated. Okay, it's very small indeed, but that's attracting money from China, attracting money from Indonesia, Malaysia, but also now from Switzerland. Money going into there in a well-regulated area. Some very familiar names there as well, but ones where the reputation is actually seen to be still pretty solid.
So let's talk about the wider banking system then, because obviously this focused on Switzerland, but we also had wobbles in the United States with Silicon Valley Bank, among others. Do you now think that the worst is over, or are we in the calm before the storm?
You have to be extremely careful in moments like this, because it's not just a banking crisis. It's what you're dealing with, an economy which has remarkably been quite resilient after having a pandemic, after having a banking crisis and the interest rates rising. But there's still a lot of fear out there that there's more to come. And it doesn't necessarily mean that companies are going to go bust. It's just the fact people are fearful. And where are they putting their money? Into cash funds. I'm going into cash, I'm coming out of equities. Now, at some stage, that will probably turn around. If you think the world's going to be doomed, then get a case of scotch and go and sit in a cave in Wales. If you think that somehow we'll muddle our way through, then there'll be a time when actually you can go back in investing in the market. But if you're a longer-term investor, just ignore it for the moment. You make your primary returns not from stocks and shares going up and down. That's where you have to rely on silly people in red braces, which I wouldn't. What you have to do is you then rely on the compounding, those dividends. They sound really dull, but you compound those dividends over years, you will make more money doing that than having a punt on the stock market, which is, frankly, a financial version of horse racing.
Justin, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us again today. That's Justin Stewart, investment manager and business commentator. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, all bang and no bucks. Virgin Orbit goes into free fall after a disastrous rocket launch earlier this year.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Virgin Orbit, the satellite launch company founded by the British billionaire Sir Richard Branson, has filed for bankruptcy in the United States.
The company failed to secure long-term financing after a high-profile rocket failure in January. Our correspondent Michael Voss reports.
Virgin Orbit's Launcher 1 rocket is designed to fit beneath a Boeing 747 and then released once airborne to carry small satellites into space. It's been operating out of the US since 2021. But earlier this year, the first launch from the UK went disastrously wrong. The rocket failed to reach orbit and sent its payload of US and UK intelligence satellites crashing into the sea. Last week, the company announced it was laying off 85% of its workforce. Now, after failing to secure additional funding following the rocket failure, the California-based company has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the hope of finding a buyer. The company has listed assets of about $250 million and total debt at $150 million. In a written statement, Virgin Orbit's CEO Dan Hart said that while we've taken great efforts to address our financial position and secure additional financing, we ultimately must do what is best for the business.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. And liftoff. God.
Space was until recently the preserve of governments, but now there are numerous space ventures financed by multi-billionaires, some of which have been labelled vanity projects. Virgin Orbit is a spin-off from Richard Branson's space tourism company Virgin Galactic, which saw the British billionaire become one of its first clients. Amazon's Jeff Bezos also owns the space tourism company Blue Origin. He too was one of the first to take a weightless ride. Virgin Orbit had hoped that its relatively cheap $12 million Launcher 1 rockets, released from a jumbo jet, would allow at short notice small satellite launches from anywhere. But such ambitions now depend on finding a willing buyer. And that buyer may soon be put off by the competition from Elon Musk's SpaceX, which provides large rockets for NASA launches, making shared payloads more cost-effective. Michael Voss, CGTN.
Oil prices have continued to rise after the OPEC Plus group's surprise output target cut.
Brent crude is up to almost $85 a barrel, with a gain of 7.5% over Monday and Tuesday. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has criticised the cut by OPEC and says it's an unconstructive act that will add uncertainty to global growth and burdens consumers at a time of high inflation.
The United States and the European Union have pledged to confront any attempts to destabilise global energy markets.
The EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken were among the co-chairs at an Energy Council meeting in Brussels. Discussions included the impact of the invasion of Ukraine and how to ensure energy security while accelerating the green transition.
Asia is set for strong growth this year. That's according to the Asian Development Bank. The Manila-based bank says economies in Asia and the Pacific are expected to grow by 4.8% this year. And the main factor behind the outlook is China's post-pandemic reopening. It says the world's second largest economy is on track to grow by 5% this year and 4.5% next year.
Well, Dr. Albert Park is chief economist at the bank and oversaw the annual economic outlook report. I asked him about Asia's growth prospects.
Story really is that the region is putting the pandemic behind it and returning back to normal rates of growth. Still not quite as high as before the pandemic, but China was really the last major economy to kind of move away from lockdowns, and obviously it had a zero COVID policy. And our increased forecasts for growth in Asia are mainly driven by China's opening up. So previously we had forecast China to grow at 4.3% this year. Now we're forecasting it to grow at 5% this year. And there's even a chance that it will be even a more robust recovery than that. So we anticipate the possibility of upside risk. India has also been a steady grower recently. There's been very healthy consumption and investment in the past year, and it continues into this year. India is a little bit less exposed to the global downturn in external demand caused by very slow growth in the U.S. and Europe because it doesn't export quite as much as some of the other economies in the region. But it's really the domestic demand story that has been driving growth. It's a young country. They're making a lot of infrastructure investments. They're incentivizing development of the manufacturing sector. So those two countries obviously form the largest part of GDP in the region, and their healthy growth is a big part of the overall region's robust growth projection.
Your optimism is infectious. The cynics and your critics might suggest that Ukraine rumbles on, geopolitical tensions aren't going away. I wonder if this weekend's decision by oil-producing countries to cut oil output might reignite inflationary pressures. You're not tempted to put the report in the shredder just yet?
Right. In fact, the title of our report says "Brightened Outlook Amid Remaining Challenges." And obviously, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if it escalates, will put more pressure on global commodity prices, energy prices, food prices, and that does definitely remain a risk to the outlook. The OPEC decision doesn't help at all our baseline forecast was that oil price would be about $88 per barrel this year and $90 next year. That's still a little bit above where we are even after the OPEC decision, but that forecast kind of anticipated that with China's recovery, Chinese consumers would be demanding more energy, and so this would put upward pressure. So it's certainly a risk that if the supply remains constrained either because of OPEC's intentions or because of disruptions or tensions from the war, then that would put pressure on the region, because that would keep inflation concerns really very visible for many countries in the region. It would also increase the cost to consumers as well as producers.
And I'm wondering about the other key risks to Asia's growth, and I'm thinking about the downturn in demand for computer chips that's perhaps damaged the outlook for major exporters like Taiwan, Singapore and South Korea.
Yeah, so suppressed external demand is a drag on growth. If it were more healthier, our growth projections would be even higher. The semiconductor industry is in a secular downturn. We expect by the end of the year it should start to turn around and reverse itself. But for other economies, the ones that are not these major tech exporters, for instance, many of the ASEAN countries, this suppressed external demand is balanced by, again, rising domestic demand driven by recovery from the pandemic. And that's really the source of momentum in our forecast.
Canadian mining company Teck Resources has rejected an unsolicited approach from the world's most profitable coal miner, Glencore. It was a bid of more than $22 billion and would have created a natural resources giant valued at more than $90 billion. Teck Resources cited its reluctance to expose its shareholders to thermal coal, oil, LNG and related sectors. Shares in Teck jumped 15% in early trading. Glencore says it is still interested in the company.
The German auditor of Wirecard, EY, has been fined more than $500,000 following audit failures. The company has also been banned for 2 years from taking on new audits for companies of public interest. EY confirmed that an investigation had been completed by watchdog APAS. Wirecard filed for insolvency in 2020, owing creditors almost $4 billion.
France's L'Oréal has agreed to buy Australian luxury brand Aesop for just over $2.5 billion. The deal is expected to grow L'Oréal's presence with an eye to international expansion, including in China. L'Oréal bought Aesop from Brazil's Natura, owner of Avon and The Body Shop, providing relief amid shrinking margins and heavy debt.
Pakistan's central bank has raised its benchmark interest rate to a record 21% as the country struggles with 50-year high inflation. Pakistan is in talks with the International Monetary Fund for a $6.5 billion bailout to avoid a default. IMF officials say Pakistan has a few more tasks to complete before that loan, delayed from late last year, can be paid out.
Mortgage holders in Australia are enjoying a brief break from a record 10 consecutive interest rate rises.
The Reserve Bank of Australia has paused its aggressive policy at its April meeting. Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports now from Sydney.
This was the first time in nearly a year that economists across Australia were somewhat divided over what they thought the Reserve Bank of Australia would do at its April meeting, especially following a record 10 consecutive interest rate hikes that have equated to a 3.5 basis point increase since last May. The central bank at its last meeting had suggested a pause was imminent, and there's been a slight drop in the inflation rate here in this country, suggesting that Australia may have passed the peak as far as inflation goes. As a result, the RBA has chosen to keep the official cash rate at 3.6%. It also noted there's a lag between those interest rate hikes and the impact to consumers, and it wanted to take some time to assess that particular impact. It also noted global inflation remains high, and the fallout continues from the collapse of some banks overseas. Now, the RBA is hoping to bring inflation down to its targeted range of 2 to 3% by 2025, and it believes it's on track. It's also noted that consumer spending in this country has slowed, but it did add in its monthly statement that a further tightening may be necessary to rein in inflation, basically meaning that any brief respite that mortgage holders are enjoying at the moment could very well be short-lived. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Tourism in Thailand is bouncing back after the pandemic. The country is heavily dependent on earnings from leisure, but while visitors have returned, high inflation is raising travel costs and could threaten the sector's recovery. Our correspondent Desita Salkau reports.
After almost 3 years, Khao San Road in Bangkok is emerging from the COVID tunnel. The music upbeat, the lights shine bright, there's laughter and good times. It's hard to imagine that not long ago, this street became a ghost of its former self, a tableau of desolate streets and shuttered businesses. Now, local businesses and merchants are gearing up for what is expected to be a busy season.
This tourism boom has been a long time in the making, especially for a country like Thailand. Tourism targets set by Thailand's government have so far been met. The recovery can be felt just by walking through the streets of Bangkok. But what can also be felt is inflation, and tourists are feeling the squeeze.
So the cost and the capacity of expenditure is different that we had back in 2018. However, yes, we seem like 3 times more expensive everything, approximately.
Although inflation in Thailand came in at 3.8% in February, it is not reflected in the prices. From flights to hotels to dining out, just about everything is more expensive. Flights from China, Thailand's biggest tourism market by far, still hovering at 1.5 times pre-pandemic prices. Some travel companies reporting increases of up to 70% in hotel rates due to the soaring demand of Chinese guests since China's reopening. But some in the industry say that high hotel daily rates could be short-lived.
There are entrepreneurs who raise prices due to market conditions, but when they are confident that they are able to run their businesses after years of losses, they will have to consider their competitors. So Thailand should return to a state where travelers feel that the price is not too expensive.
Although price hikes are helping hotels recoup substantial losses from the past 3 years and potentially help drive further growth, what hotels view as growth comes at a detriment to the finances of travelers. According to Dragon Trail, the average amount spent per Chinese traveler has increased up to 3 times more than what it was during pre-pandemic times.
The government has not yet been able to control the tourism market well enough, so many businesses have seized the opportunity from the supply shocks. It's a golden opportunity for them to set their own prices for products and services.
Pent-up demand is driving this industry, fueled largely by the Chinese market. But come low season, it will become an industry that will be tested by recession, high travel costs, and inflation. For now, it's high times, it's adrenaline, as tourism is having its moment. Desita Salkau, CGTN, Bangkok, Thailand.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. As Finland officially joins NATO, what does the enlargement mean for the military alliance?
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult.
In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail. The background.
Defense ministers from
The wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Trump turns himself in. The former US president prepares to face criminal charges in a watershed hearing in New York. Thousands of his supporters gather outside the court.
The chairman of Credit Suisse apologises to angry investors for taking the bank to the brink of bankruptcy.
And falling to earth and filing for bankruptcy, Virgin Orbit goes into freefall after a disastrous rocket launch earlier this year.
French President Emmanuel Macron is preparing for his state visit to China, where improving diplomatic relations is high on the agenda.
He'll be joined by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for this three-day visit. Business leaders will also travel with the politicians as the EU and China look to revive trade that was damaged by the pandemic.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. So, Ross, what is the French president planning on this trip?
Yeah, good evening, Robin. He will be visiting China tomorrow, Wednesday, the 5th of April, for the first time since he was re-elected as president in June 2022. Two previous trips in his first term in office, but it will be the first time Ursula von der Leyen will be visiting China in her official capacity as president of the European Commission. Touching down on Wednesday, and then Thursday will be the big set-piece events. We expect meetings with Li Qiang, the Chinese premier, and of course Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. There'll be a state dinner, there will be a trilateral summit between von der Leyen, Macron and Xi, and then also some final meetings on Friday. President Macron will also be attending a second meal hosted by Xi Jinping.
So, Ross, what can we expect from these trilateral discussions between the two European leaders and China's President Xi?
Well, Ursula von der Leyen has made her position very clear, saying that earlier today, Tuesday, she was speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, saying that she will be raising the issue of what China describes as a crisis, Russia calls a special military operation, and Ukraine, the European Union and France all describe as an invasion and a war. She says she will be raising the issue with both Premier Li and also with President Xi, looking for China's influence in this situation, saying that what Ukraine needs is a just peace that respects its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. We know Emmanuel Macron will also be bringing up the issue of Ukraine. He would like to see Xi Jinping using his influence, the Chinese leader's influence, with the Kremlin to try to force Russia to withdraw its troops from inside Ukraine. So both leaders will be united on that front and united in their support for Ukraine, and also supportive of China trying to play a political role in finding a political solution, negotiated peace to the conflict that is taking place in Ukraine. Aside from that, there are many other issues to be discussed. One of those is trade, and we can take a look now to our reports on that issue.
In 2022, China was the third biggest destination for EU exports, and more than 20% of EU imports came from China. European business executives and their political leaders will be hoping to expand business ties during the upcoming visit by Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron, now that all pandemic controls have been relaxed. According to the French Chamber of Commerce and Industry in China, France is the biggest European investor in China by the number of companies. French firms from various sectors invest in China, from cosmetics to energy and tyres. And together the French firms employ roughly 445,000 people in China. One of the two biggest aircraft manufacturers in the world is headquartered in France. Last month, Airbus announced the delivery of its first A321neo plane assembled in China. The European plane maker will be one of the firms looking to try to expand its presence there. Oil and gas giant TotalEnergies has been operating in China for more than 35 years. With more than 3,400 employees in the country. One area where the EU and China hope to deepen ties is on the fight against climate change, and Total has been working on expanding its solar production in China, another possible outlet for expanded commercial ties between Paris and Beijing.
So aside from the politics from Ukraine and also the Indo-Pacific, that will be one where Emmanuel Macron will want to raise the issues. France has 1.5 million citizens in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Aside from those political issues, there will of course be those business opportunities, with dozens of business executives from all sorts of different sectors going along with Emmanuel Macron on his visit tomorrow. So we'll be looking out for business opportunities, but also set-piece politics, particularly at that trilateral summit between von der Leyen, Macron and Xi.
Ross, thank you very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
An historic day, that's how the head of NATO described Finland's membership as it became the newest member to join the military alliance. The Finnish flag has been raised in the ceremony outside NATO headquarters in Brussels. Jens Stoltenberg said Finland's accession would guarantee it ironclad security. Well, let's take a closer look now at the makeup of this alliance. The military bloc was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War with 12 founding members, but has since doubled in size to 30 member countries. Finland is now the 31st member state to become part of the alliance. The last country to join was North Macedonia in 2020. But Sweden, which applied alongside Finland, is still waiting to join the club, pending approval from Turkey and Hungary. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, just beyond the ceremonials, what does this mean in real terms?
Well, Jamie, politically, this is a very, very big shift for Finland. Finland has always been, or has been, militarily neutral for decades now, and it's been committed to that military non-alignment policy basically since the end of the Second World War. The Finnish president saying, well, that era has come to an end and a new era is beginning. It also means that Finland now falls under the Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which means an attack on Finland as of today will be taken by NATO allies as an attack on all of them, prompting a collective defensive response. That is the core principle, the fundamental principle of NATO that Finland now falls under. But practically on the other hand, there won't be a massive change. It's not like a brand new country that had no relationship with NATO had joined the alliance today. Finland has joined NATO on operations abroad, on peacekeeping operations, for example, in Kosovo. Finland's military in many ways is interoperable. That NATO term basically means it works on in many of the same ways as NATO's military standards. It has similar equipment, similar tactics and similar philosophy when it comes to security issues. So Finland has been a very close partner whilst not a member of the NATO alliance. So on the ground there will be not a huge amount of changes. Also looking at that border with Russia, which now doubles NATO's border with Russia, that massive Finnish border with Russia. Finland not requesting more NATO troops on the border, not particularly hoping to bolster their presence there, whereas the Russians are saying, well, actually NATO's membership could be seen as a threat to Russia's security, and therefore they may respond in kind. Now, having said that, the Finnish president was very keen to downplay any of those conflicting or conflictual rhetorics, saying today that it is just an important day for Finland. Let's have a listen to what he said earlier today.
It is a great day for Finland, and I want to see that it is an important day for NATO too. Security and stability are those elements which we feel strongly. And, well, we can all think that if people can live in secure, stable circumstances. That's the basic element of happy life.
Alex, let's just put Finland to one side for a moment, because NATO's boss Jens Stoltenberg said today he was confident it wouldn't be too long before Sweden joined too. I mean, is there a sense that Turkey, which has until now been blocking Sweden's membership, might just give its approval soon?
Well, there's no clear timeline for that yet. There's been no date set in the Turkish parliament, Jamie, for that vote on accession. You also have the bloc from Hungary, and no date set for the Hungarian parliament to vote on the accession. Still some objections, still some issues there. The hopeful timeline, the ambition for NATO would be that the accession for Sweden would happen before the NATO leaders summit in Vilnius in July, and NATO saying that there are no more issues to be resolved, and Sweden has done everything it needs to do to satisfy Turkey's demands. That is something that was echoed earlier today by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and let's have a listen to what he said on this.
Nothing should hinder or be an obstacle for also the final ratification of also Sweden to become a member. This is a top priority for the alliance. This is important for me personally, and all allies agree that we should try to finalize the accession also of Sweden as soon as possible.
So Jens Stoltenberg there not being drawn into a timeline, not really being able to give a specific timeline, but hoping that it will happen as soon as possible. In the meantime, we wait.
Alex, we've talked about Sweden, we've talked about Finland, but perhaps you could give us a sense of the wider NATO community and whether or not this is utterly unanimous, or there have been mutterings among the other member countries and beyond.
Well, there haven't been specific mutterings about Sweden and Finland, but you have, as you said, frustrations from Turkey and Hungary. And actually, this is part of the NATO process. And part of the reason why this takes so long is that there has to be consensus. You're absolutely right to point that out. And nothing happens without unanimity when it comes to new members joining. And so this is really, you can either see it from two sides. Either this is a highlight of the cracks within NATO, divisions within NATO, disagreement within NATO allies and not being able to move forward, or it's the process of a defensive military alliance with a number of democracies with their own domestic political issues, domestic security issues, and their own parliaments to ratify accession. So at the moment, there is a united front despite some of those grumblings, and only time will tell very clearly how soon Sweden's accession will be approved, both by Turkey and by Hungary, Jamie.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Alex Cadier in Brussels.
Australia has banned the social media app TikTok on all federal government devices. It's the latest country to take action against the Chinese-owned video sharing service over what it says are security concerns. TikTok called the move political. Beijing has urged Canberra to abide by the rules of the market and fair competition.
China has always maintained that the issue of data security should not become a tool for generalizing the concept of national security, abusing national power and unreasonably suppressing the enterprises of other countries. We urge Australia to effectively abide by the rules of the market economy and the principle of fair competition, and to provide Chinese enterprises with a fair, transparent and non-discriminatory business environment.
Meanwhile, TikTok has been fined nearly $16 million by the UK's data watchdog for misusing children's data. A British investigation found the company had used the data of 1.4 million children under the age of 13 without parental consent. TikTok disputed the ruling and said it had changed its practices since the investigation.
A passenger train in the Netherlands has crashed into a maintenance crane and derailed into a field, killing the crane operator and injuring dozens of passengers. Officials say it's unclear why the crane was on the track, which was still open to railway traffic. Train services will be suspended for the next few days between The Hague and Leiden, one of the country's busiest routes.
An avalanche in India's Himalayan region has killed at least 7 people and several others are feared trapped. Search and rescue operations are continuing. India's army says 6 vehicles carrying around 30 tourists to the mountain pass are thought to be stuck in the snow.
Well, let's return now to the news of Finland's accession to the military alliance NATO, and the Kremlin says that that raises the risk of conflict and that Moscow is prepared to take countermeasures to protect its security. Let's talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. So, Dasha, what has been the response in Russia to Finland joining NATO?
Well, indeed, we have heard from the Kremlin saying that that was another escalation of the situation. Moscow believes that the expansion of the military alliance is an encroachment on Russia's security and national interests, so Russia will be forced to retaliate and to take countermeasures. Now, we have also heard from the Russian Foreign Ministry saying that Finland has now lost its independence. It used to have, while being neutral, its own unique voice in the geopolitical arena. Now it is one of the minor countries of NATO that does not decide anything. So indeed, a lot of rhetoric coming from Moscow with regards to the expansion of the military alliance. But Moscow also says that NATO has been increasing its anti-Russian course, according to Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. Let's hear to what else he had to say.
We are taking retaliatory measures and defending the security of the Union state. Some Belarusian ground attack aircraft received the ability to strike at enemy targets with nuclear weapons. In addition, Iskander-M operational tactical missile systems were handed over to the Belarusian armed forces. It can use both conventional and nuclear missiles.
So Russia's response will be proportionate, and according to the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, that will be announced in due time. But what Moscow is saying here, that it will closely observe whether NATO infrastructure, military infrastructure, is now located in Finland. And of course, according to that, Russia will be making its own decisions. But we have also heard before from the Russian Federation the announcement of Russia increasing its military capacities and setting up 2 new military districts, and also beefing up its western and northwestern flanks.
Dasha, thank you very much. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow.
US holidaymakers have been warned against travelling to Mexico for spring breaks due to safety concerns.
The State Department says it's too dangerous, with drug cartel violence and other criminal activity posing a significant threat to visitors. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
Mexico, a popular destination over spring break, welcoming millions of tourists from the United States every year. However, while visitors come to relax, they are aware of increased security concerns here.
We thought a little bit about what neighborhoods we were going to stay in, talked to friends who live in Mexico. We definitely took care when we were planning the trip, but we felt safe the entire time.
I tend to feel confident going places even if I shouldn't, I guess. But I haven't experienced any reason to feel concerned while I'm here.
Indeed, recent travel advisory updates by the US State Department could be making holidaymakers think twice about travelling to Mexico. 6 states of this country's 32 carry full do-not-travel warnings over fears of crime and kidnapping, while visitors are cautioned to reconsider travel to 7 more. Overall, only 2 Mexican states are given the all-clear. Alejandro Hope is a security analyst in Mexico.
The travel advisory that is produced by the State Department has to be done with a really broad brush. Crime tends to be concentrated in a few areas or a few cities of a few regions. Yeah, I mean, the risk is low, but that is not the perception.
In Mexico City, tourists are well aware of the risks, but they say they know how to avoid problems.
We're also all from cities in the United States, and any city in the world can be dangerous depending on where you are in the city. And so I feel like we're kind of not that afraid of that level of risk as long as we kind of keep our wits about ourselves.
However, for college-age spring breakers with less experience and frequenting party areas, danger may be closer than they think.
Some behavior by tourists might enhance risk, one of which is attempting to buy or consume illegal drugs. That puts you in touch with illicit markets. Illicit markets is where the violence tends to happen.
As Mexico welcomes 2023's spring breakers, the country's tourism industry is depending on their safe return when the holidays are finished. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
Now, the Yangtze anchovy is a popular delicacy in China, but it's facing extinction.
Now, one of the country's largest anchovy breeding farms is helping to restore depleted fish stocks. Our correspondent Wu Bin reports.
Master Chef Wang is preparing a dish using Yangtze tapertail anchovy. They're also known as coilia fish, but locals here have a simpler name in Chinese, knife fish. Looking at its bright silver skin and sharp tail, it's easy to understand why. Every year around Tomb Sweeping Day in early April, diners flock to the small island city of Yangzhong to sample the delicacy. The fish once thrived in the Yangtze River and was an important source of income for many locals. But it has almost become extinct after years of overfishing, and the market price has risen exponentially. In 2021, China introduced a 10-year fishing ban in a bid to restore biodiversity in the Yangtze River. Artificial breeding has become the solution to help meet market demand and is a requirement of the ban. Tapertail anchovy has been farmed in Yangzhong for over 6 years, but the process is extremely challenging. At China's biggest anchovy fish farm, we meet technical advisor Li Xiaowang, who is welcoming a group of visitors to the facility. He's an expert when it comes to breeding the species.
The fish is too fragile. It will die almost instantly after leaving the water. So it's revolutionary that we have a breakthrough in the breeding process.
The first year of the artificial breeding program yielded thousands of anchovy. The number has since passed 1 million a year. The focus now is on genetically engineering the species to become more resilient and working with China's state electricity grid company to develop an automated feeding system.
In the past, we fed the fish manually. The fish would often concentrate in one spot. The knife fish are too fast, often colliding and injuring each other. Many of them won't survive after being injured.
The National Yangtze Tapertail Anchovy Demonstration Center is expected to produce 50,000 fish for market this year. Li says the aim is now to shorten the time it takes for the fish to reach maturity from 3 to 2 years, to further increase market yield every year. The breeding technology being used will also allow some of the artificially bred anchovy to be released into the Yangtze River, potentially helping restore fish stocks. Wu Bin, CGTN, Yangzhong City, Jiangsu Province.
The headlines again. Trump turns himself in. The former president prepares to face criminal charges in a watershed hearing in New York. Thousands of his supporters have gathered outside the court.
Our other headlines, the chairman of Credit Suisse apologizes to angry investors for taking the bank to the brink of bankruptcy.
And the Finnish flag is raised at NATO headquarters as it becomes the 31st member of the defence alliance. The length of Russia's border with NATO countries has now doubled.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.